Here is part 3 of chapter 75. Vorsa, who became professor of archaeology at Copenhagen and then succeeded Thomsen as director of the museum, is often called the first professional archaeologist. His mentor Thomsen called him a heaven stormer. Vorsa accurately praised Thomsen's three-age system as, quote, the first clear ray shed across the universal prehistoric gloom of the North and the world in general, end of quote. Not in the heavenly documented realms of recent history, but in the dark recesses of earliest times would mankind first discover the universality of history. The first discovery of the community of all human experience in eras and epochs, the worldwide phenomena of human history, was made when prehistory was parsed into the three ages, stone, bronze, and iron. And as Vorsa explored the boundaries between the three ages, he began to raise some profound questions that were explosive for fundamentalist Christians. One of these was the problem still agitated by anthropologists: independent invention or cultural diffusion. The disturbing notion, suggested by bold thinkers from Buffon to Darwin, that man had existed long before the biblical date of creation in 4004 BC, was beginning to be accepted by the scientific community. But the remote antiquity of man was popularized not so much by a theory as by the discovery of a vast and undeniable subject matter, a new dark continent of time, prehistory. More persuasively than a theory, the artifacts themselves seemed to bear witness to a chronology of prehistory that argued the evolution of man's culture. Gradually, as the word prehistory came into use in the European languages, the idea entered popular consciousness. The exhibition in Hyde Park in 1851, which purported to survey all the works of humankind, still gave no glimpse of prehistory. Then, at the Universal Exhibition in Paris in 1867, the Hall of the History of Labor showed an extensive collection of artifacts from all over Europe and from Egypt. The official guide to prehistoric walks at the Universal Exhibition offered 3 lessons from the new science: the law of the progress of humanity, the law of similar development, and the high antiquity of man. In that same year, the announcement of the first Congrès International Préhistorique de Paris brought the first official use of the word prehistoric. Prehistory entered the curriculum of public education along with the companion ideas of evolution. Charles Darwin's disciple and leading popularizer, John Lubbock, Lord Avebury, 1834 to 1913, made a European reputation by fitting prehistory into evolution. His Prehistoric Times, 1865, which coined the words Paleolithic and Neolithic for the, quote, polished Stone Age, was widely read by laymen who imbibed prehistory and evolution in a single delightful read. The Origin of Civilization, written in 1871, drew on widely separated evidences of centers of the three ages to argue that the crucial inventions had arisen independently, all of which seemed to support Herbert Spencer's argument that, quote, progress is not an accident, but a necessity. It is a fact of nature, end of quote. When Schliemann came to London in 1875, William E. Gladstone saluted him by recalling that when they were growing up, quote, prehistoric times lay before our eyes like a silver cloud covering the whole of the lands that, at different periods of history, had become illustrious and interesting. Now we are beginning to see through this dense mist, and the cloud is becoming transparent, and the figures of real places, real men, real facts are slowly beginning to reveal to us their outlines, end of quote. The pioneer anthropologist Edward B. Tylor optimistically announced in 1871 that prehistory finally had, quote, taken its place in the general scheme of knowledge, end of quote, extending the vistas of human history 1,000-fold. The three ages, the worldwide epochs of prehistory, made it easier to imagine other epochs that transcended city, region, or nation. By defining latitudes of history, man had enlarged his view of the world's past and present. The invention of grand historical eras, epochs, or ages, which overreached political bounds, would provide time receptacles ample enough to include the whole data of past communities of culture, yet small enough for persuasive definition. Few other concepts have done so much to de-provincialize man's thinking. The ages of history would dominate and sometimes tyrannize the modern historian, focusing his vision on clusters of past experience: the Great Age of Greece, the Middle Ages, the Age of Feudalism, the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, modern industrialism, the rise of capitalism, etc. These notions were to time what the species were to nature, a way of classifying experience to make it useful. They were the taxonomy of history. Of course, just as with species, there was the danger that the label would be taken for the thing. The mere name of an epoch might somehow become a force governing interpretation of the events. Still, the advantages of the epical way of thinking far outweighed the risks. The convenient groupings of men, events, achievements, and institutions helped bring some order into the puzzling miscellany of the past. The 6, quote, world periods, aitates, into which the early church fathers had divided all time before the coming of Christ, were not historical but prophetic and theological. They did not characterize the past, but were categories of prophecy, stages toward the incarnation. The spirit of the age, John Stuart Mill, 1806 to 1873, explained in 1831, quote, is in some measure a novel expression. I do not believe that it is to be met with in any work exceeding 50 years in antiquity. The idea of comparing one's own age with former ages, or with our notion of those which are yet to come, had occurred to philosophers, but it never before was itself the dominant idea of any age. Before men began to think much and long on the peculiarities of their own times, they must have begun to think that those times are, or are destined to be, distinguished in a very remarkable manner from the times that preceded them. End of quote. The idea of homogeneous epochs in history, he added, was consistent either with the notion of cycles or with, quote, the idea of a trajectory or progress, end of quote. Mill plumped for, quote, the progressiveness of the human race, the foundation on which a method of philosophizing in the social science has been of late years erected, end of quote. How could one imagine progress without some notion of the coherence of events in each epoch? Now a host of new influences, museums, archaeological excavations, international expositions, along with the daily press and the periodical press, was spreading a consciousness of history beyond academic circles, preparing people to believe that they lived in an age of progress. Quote, there is a progressive change, John Stuart Mill concluded from his study of history, both in the character of the human race and in their outward circumstances so far as molded by themselves. In each successive age, the principal phenomena of society are different from what they were in the age preceding, and still more different from any previous age. End of quote. A vivid reminder of these newly drawn latitudes of time was the invention in the mid-19th century of the Age of the Renaissance, to describe an era in Europe from about the 14th to the 17th century. The French nationalist historian Jules Michelet entitled the 7th volume of his History of France, The Renaissance, 1855, and saw the era dominated by, quote, the discovery of the world and the discovery of man, end of quote. Then the Swiss historian Jakob Burckhardt's Civilization of the Renaissance in Italy, in 1860, offered a classic portrait of the men and institutions that gave the era its character and made it the mother of modern European civilization. So a student, confident in the jargon of historical epics, could characterize Dante as, quote, a man who stood with one foot in the Middle Ages and with the other saluted the rising star of the Renaissance, end of quote. In our century, much of the scholarly debate over the nature of the Renaissance has concerned the latitudes of time. When did the Renaissance begin? Was it the same phenomenon in different parts of Europe? Two grand assumptions which lay beneath talk of the Renaissance shaped future thinking about man's role in all history. First, belief that every age somehow exuded a prevailing spirit, what German scholars called the Zeitgeist, what Carl Becker called the climate of opinion, which favored certain notions and institutions. Second, that within these limits, men had the power to make history. Renaissance men made a Renaissance. If, as Burckhardt explained, they made the state, quote, a work of art, end of quote, in later ages too, men could accomplish the unprecedented. And that finally concludes Chapter 75.